we're recording.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our fall roundtable series hosted by the Center for Empowering Victims of Gender-Based Violence located in the Department of Criminal Justice. Actually, this is the first time we are in person and also virtually with Ashley on campus. Before we usually do a virtual version via Zoom, and this time we could actually face-to-face with a couple of panelists. And thank you so much for those who are here and support this important research topic. And you can see here today we're going to focusing on researching gender in rural communities. And this topic have multiple layers of information. And today we're really trying to bring in some of the research ideas, literatures, and a celebration for faculty's research with you all. So hopefully everybody can engage in some great discussion, and then we're going to open up with some of the discussions shortly. First of all, I would like to introduce our panelists today. First of all, from the very end of the table here is Dr. Christy Craig. Dr. Christy Craig is an assistant professor of sociology. Immediately beside Dr. Christy Craig is Dr. April N. Terry. Dr. Terry is an associate professor of criminal justice. Immediately beside Dr. Terry is Dr. Morgan Steele. Dr. Morgan Steele is an assistant professor of criminal justice. If you look at the screen, it's Miss Ashley Lockwood, and she's currently actually pursuing a doctoral degree in criminal justice at Central Florida State University. And University of Central Florida, thank you for the correction. And Ashley actually is a former master's degree student, graduate from psychology department. And I am the moderator today. My name is Ziwei Qi. Feel free to call me Dr. Z. And I am the co-founder of the Center for Empowering Victims of Gender-Based Violence. So today is really a time to share the topics on how to research gender in rural communities. So I will start with some discussion from our panelists. Please feel free to reach out to the microphone or shout out from Ashley's screen. And if you feel strong about the following topics. So the first question will be, what do gender relation mean in a rural context? Is that going to be different compared to urban settings? How that gender relation really manifested? So if any of the panelists would like to take the microphone.
Do you want me to go first? That's fine. Okay. Okay. Well, briefly, there's no such thing as one rural gendered experience, so we need to recognize that when we're examining gender, we need to look at the intersecting realities of gendered experiences. So when we look at rural experiences, particularly related to access to justice, we need to think about different realities that come into play, so class, race, immigration status, gender. And so I think the question would really be, why wouldn't we look at gender? I'm not sure there would be a time that we shouldn't be examining gender in this regard. I think what I would mimic what Dr. Craig said, but I would also add like the focus on the rural piece. So I was just writing on something before I came here regarding differences in rural and urban areas. So as someone, I think all of us, interested in rural places, and especially in our fields, a lot of the research focuses in urban areas, and for example, in criminological theories, most of them have been done on males in very urbanized places. So in addition to saying gender is always important, so in feminist criminology, we would say it's never just add women and stir, because it's always part of the equation and not like an afterthought. But I would also argue that with place. So assuming that everything that happens in an urban setting related to gender and all of the other intersectional aspects, to assume that that applies to rural areas is really sort of a mistake. But again, that's a lot of what we see in our field, is that people say, hey, let's study this gendered issue here in this very urban setting, and then we can assume that that applies everywhere. But the little bit of research that kind of has been done in rural places would say that's not right. That's not good practice. That's not really what we find. So I think that was part of what your question is sort of gender and the rule piece. So I would just piggyback what she said and also add that, yeah, it's definitely place dependent also. I think I was planning to contribute to that more so than Dr. Steele, but I don't know if Ashley was going to contribute. No pressure.
I just didn't want to shout at you guys while you were still talking, but yeah, I think mimicking both of those points, those are important points. I think when we think about rural places specifically, maybe, I know our recent research was in the state of Kansas, obviously, but some of those, even just how people at a very face value perceive gender or think about gender, services related to gender can vary in rural places because there are such more traditional social norms in a lot of those places. So whether it be a focus on girls, like in our paper, or other genders, whatever those may be, those might be viewed differently, even by service providers in different, more urban areas, or the literature might speak to something that's trying to be generalized to other areas, but might not be a good fit, as Dr. Terry said, to rural places for girls or other genders.
Thank you very much for the panelist response. It seems like the gender relation is highly intersectional, complex, and then when you put a rural context in the situation, become a much more dynamic. Gender relation in rural context is a very different when compared to urban and suburban, and it is important. And this actually leading to our next step to dig deeper about the research our panelists has published and is ongoing, because essentially this is time to celebrate researching gender in a rural context. So the next question will be switch up a little bit on the PowerPoint. It's a time to really ask our panelists to share a little bit more on your recent published articles. I know there are mainly two pieces. One is a co-authored articles recently published by Dr. April Terry, Dr. Morgan Steele, and Ms. Ashley Lockwood. And also, I will really much like to learn about Dr. Christy Craig, your research particularly focusing on gender-based violence in rural context as well. So if any of you would like to go ahead and share some of your research, that would be really wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, I can go first because mine's ongoing. Okay. So, thanks. So Dr. Z and I are working on a book chapter that's been accepted, so we're still doing some research and some final edits on that chapter, but we've been looking at sort of the intangible costs of intimate partner violence, particularly for women in rural areas. So our research is examining what sorts of resources are available, what sorts of experiences women in rural areas may have that are different from women experiencing family-based violence in more urban areas. Certainly there's a lot of overlap, but when we look at a lot of the studies in rural gender-based violence, they come out of Australia, and we are a bit behind in the United States on that research. So we are digging deeper into that to try to look through a gendered lens to see what those experiences are like, and recognizing that some of the social and cultural outcomes for women in rural areas may differ in some ways compared to more urban environments with more resources. So I will start by talking about one of a recent publication that we have, and then if there is time permitting or interest, then we could talk about things that we have ongoing. So as Dr. Z said, the three of us had published a piece specific to juvenile intake numbers here in Kansas. So assuming not everybody studies criminal justice, I'll give you a quick rundown of what we're talking about. So if a kid in Kansas were to, it could be a variety of things, be a kid deemed perhaps in need of care, or a runaway youth, or a kid out committing delinquent acts. It's a variety of things. If they come into contact with law enforcement, then they're typically taken to a juvenile intake and assessment center, and those exist all around the state in the different judicial districts. And so we were interested in which youth were still presenting at those intake facilities after COVID hit. So Kansas has, until the last couple of years, been high up for our incarceration rates of youth. So that's not the same as going to detention, which is what that intake assessment would determine. But typically, we see a lot of kids going through the system here. And so we were sort of interested, how does that look now that COVID has hit? Because there were lots of informal guidelines, I will say, that told law enforcement and other youth-involved professionals to kind of step back a little bit. Unless the kid's really up to something that's pretty delinquent or criminal, we should just kind of let it be and just tell them, like, here's a notice to appear at another date. So they were trying to really reduce the number of kids who were actually engaged in an intake procedure, and then especially trying to reduce the number of kids we placed in the detention facilities. And so we wondered, are there any differences before COVID and currently? We learned not to call it post-COVID since it's ongoing, but peri-COVID, right?
Yeah.
Is that the going term? So we wanted to look at the difference specific to girls and girls in rural places. And I will let Dr. Steele talk more about the analysis, but what we know generally is that girls enter the system for very different reasons than boys do. Same with adult women, typically for less serious offenses, perhaps not even violent offenses. And we know, as like all of the panelists said, that due to different traditional norms and gender norms and expectations in rural places, the way that we handle girls in the system is also different. And so we were just interested, wonder what's happening. Are we still sending just as many girls to the intake assessment centers? Are we not? What does that look like for boys? Are we doing different things in urban places? Are we doing different things in rural places? You feel like that's a place for you to pick up? Okay, and I'll let him give you the takeaway.
Unfortunately, this probably is going to mean I'm going to talk quite a bit about math. So if something doesn't make sense, please shout out and I will try to explain as best I can. So as the panelists, or as April previously mentioned, we were using juvenile intake and assessment center data, which means we were looking at monthly counts. So just the number of children being brought to the center. This gives us no information about what they were brought in for, their economic status, the person who is bringing them in, be it a law enforcement officer, a probation officer, a teacher, whatever. So we're limited in what we can actually say is causing this, other than to say that there was a significant difference between rural and urban contexts, between male and female children. And what we basically found was that everyone saw a decline. It was the difference in the decline that was most remarkable. So in urban contexts, everyone dropped significantly. There was a significant drop in the number of boys and girls brought to juvenile intake and assessment centers for judicial districts that were categorized as urban. In rural contexts, the decline was still there. It was still statistically significant, but it was nowhere near the dramatic decline as seen in urban areas. And we present a few reasons why this could be it different social norms, different economic statuses that I'll let April and Ashley talk about, but just from a statistical standpoint, we don't know why. We just know there was a difference. So, that's that.
Ashley, do you want me to say things, or would you like to add something?
I can talk a little bit about like implications of what we found and maybe why we think we found those things.
Okay.
I think one of the things that stood out in our paper and just rural papers a lot of times in general is the mental health needs that are happening. I think COVID in general has led to a really interesting time to study the justice system as a whole, because there are shutdowns and social distancing and a lot of adjustments happening at a really rapid speed, and people kind of having to adjust to new protocols and procedures and things like that. But if we know that girls are routed into the system for more abusive family lives, more mental health needs, then that maybe can explain how even though everything is being declined, those intakes are being declined for boys and girls are still being funneled into the system at a little bit greater rate, and maybe that's somewhat a result of them just being misunderstood or them being pushed into the system for things that aren't necessarily related to criminal behavior, but are maybe those abusive family lives or inadequate mental health facilities or services that are happening as a result of COVID shutdowns and those types of things.
I would add one thing and then I'll hand it back over. So, Dr. Steele pointed this out, but I think one of our major limitations, which was outside of our control, was just how the system collects data and what data they collect. So just as Dr. Craig said, it's not just studying like girls and women, it's studying all of those other aspects that might describe that person. And as Dr. Steele said, like we couldn't consider income or any of that. Like we really had very basic data to include. We would love to know exactly maybe what town they came from, their family household income, even as we look at, for example, like race and ethnicity, Kansas just lumps the data as white and non-white. Like there's no way to actually really know, like that's the best that they have currently. So to be able to provide something more sophisticated that says it's really not just girls probably in rural areas, but maybe it's girls in rural areas, girls of color in rural areas, low income girls of color in rural areas, but it wasn't that we didn't acknowledge that, it's that we as in Kansas don't have access to that data currently. I can say though that the state of Kansas is trying to work on that, trying to make, if you will, a more sophisticated data entry system where that data would be available in the future, but it's very easy to just suggest that people do that, and it's very different than to tell the entire state to get on board and to make that a requirement that people have to enter that data at any step. So again, we were looking at juvenile intake and assessment, but really any of those decision points with kids, like people are just required to enter very basic demographic information, which makes it difficult to really get a good picture of what's going on. So I just felt like we should point that out, that we weren't intentionally neglecting that. That was just, we were working with what we had.
And I think that too, to kind of touch on that point, goes back to the discussion we had at the beginning about how gender relations work in rural communities, and that kind of paints a picture that maybe those things are just being neglected, not purposely necessarily, but places where we would maybe be conducting research or wanting that information isn't even considering that, maybe we should have that broken down a little bit further to include different races. Maybe we should have that broken down between females and males to include additional pieces.
I can say one thing, maybe. I don't know.
You can, for sure.
Okay. So I just want to sort of maybe add on to one of the things Ashley said in mentioning that perhaps there are not mental health services. Our research is also indicating that in situations of family violence, we just don't have the same kind of mental health resources available for women in these situations. So it would not be surprising that children in these scenarios are also perhaps being funneled into a system without the mental health resources, because there just aren't enough resources in rural areas. And for areas that do have resources, families often have to go many, many miles, more than 90 miles to get somewhere, and that's not an easy task on a good day. So.
Thank you for the panelists to share your current research and then some of the challenges you encounter with researching gender in rural communities. I know Dr. Terry and Dr. Steele and Ashley, you mentioned a few challenges when using a state-level juvenile intake data to understand this dynamics. And Dr. Craig, you also mentioned about how this access to services could be very skilled compared to urban versus rural. I guess as a follow-up question, what are some other challenges you think related to researching gender in rural communities? Any other challenges other than maybe access to data, access to services?
I can briefly, maybe. Briefly, anytime we're talking about personal sorts of scenarios, in a smaller community where folks know one another, it can be very difficult to share personal information, and I find this whether I'm specifically researching violence, or if we're just researching any number of gender topics. Additionally, if you are, it's kind of a two-sided coin. If you are local to a community and people know you, they might be willing to speak to you, but it's hard to share personal information. And I do primarily interview-based qualitative research, so that's sort of the lens I'm coming from. And if you are not local to some place, or you are sort of an outsider, it can also be difficult for people to feel comfortable communicating with you. And the sort of anonymity of a more urban space where people just don't know everyone can provide a different perspective on qualitative research, at least.
I should also say that I typically also do qualitative research, so that's why Dr. Steele's talking about the analysis, because that is his area of expertise. I typically do qualitative work. But I can talk about an issue with the qualitative piece. I think sometimes places are hesitant to even allow you access to such data because they know, or at least maybe anticipate, that you will uncover things that don't look great for them. So to even show, this, and I did share this with the people who shared the data and with other, kind of major administrators or stakeholders who would care about this sort of research. But I don't think most of them read it and go, this is great news. Like, we do think we are treating people differently. And while this presentation in this paper was on more of a gender aspect, we do have ongoing work where we were trying to use the very little bit of racial and ethnic data that they included to try to dissect that a little bit more as well. But I think sometimes people just don't want you to look at it because even if they don't know, most people don't have anything to gain by finding something negative. So I think sometimes that's a barrier. And since I do a lot of work with youth, I think that's not necessarily related to the rule aspect, but it's also more difficult just to obtain information from kids since they are a more vulnerable population, and it presents, added layers of protection to make sure we're doing things correctly. This being more secondary data, that wasn't necessarily an issue, but I do think there's a lot to just try to hide or not let be known when people are wanting to research things, so.
And as Dr. Terry mentioned, I am a quantitative method specialist, and one of the challenges I've ran into, not just with researching gender, but just researching rural context overall, is the issue of not a lot of things happen to a point where you can do a lot of statistical tests. So some juvenile intake and assessment centers may only admit 4 children that month. I can't do a lot with 4. But other centers may intake 100 or 200 children. And comparing those counties is a lot like comparing apples to avocados. Like, there's no realm where these two things are similar. So the challenge with conducting research in a quantitative sense in rural context is you have to go back a really long time, or you need a lot of different data points so you can provide context to that 4. So is it 3 children who are brought in because of mental health and 1 child who was delinquent, or is it an even mix? Was it a socioeconomic consideration? But at the end of the day, it comes down to what can the data itself support, and this is where qualitative pieces are actually really important in understanding the rural environment, because there's just not enough quantitative data there to really understand what's going on.
I have one more, I'm sorry. I thought of more. Another piece that I think is relevant to this is when we look at maybe some of the research on rural healthcare and training and such, that people who are doing intake for women that have experienced family violence in rural areas, many people in rural areas are doing a whole lot in the healthcare system, and so they aren't specialists. And so the research seems to indicate that a lot of Midwestern rural medical facilities don't have a full-time person to do those kinds of intakes on hand, and so a lot of information about what might be going on just isn't gathered, and we don't have folks who are trained to gather this information, and we're just not tracking the kind of information that we might want to track in a system that has a lot more people coming in and out of the system and has different people who are trained in a very specialized way and are able to devote that kind of time to gathering that kind of information. So in rural systems like this, we see when people need to deal with this, they're also dealing with lots of other roles at the same time. And so that can be a barrier to really getting a clear picture of what's happening if we're looking at intake numbers and those kinds of things.
Ashley, do you have anything to add?
I do, yeah. I think kind of all of those in culmination, but in rural places too, just in some of the work that I've done, I think that there are barriers that maybe wouldn't exist in urban places or just wouldn't exist so pervasively in terms of, you know, if we're doing research with a certain community agency or maybe in April and I's case, going to a facility to work with justice-involved youth or women, there has to be a certain buy-in from the entity that you're doing research with, right? And so sometimes in urban places where maybe they see researchers once a week and that's really common, and those topics about gender issues or whatever it may be might be a little more happening more frequently. But when you go to rural places, sometimes there is more, as April mentioned, the pushback between, you know, wanting to talk about those things. They don't want us to find things that they don't want to talk about, but also sometimes those are uncomfortable conversations to have because they are such stigmatized topics in those smaller places. So I've had incidences where, you know, you give them the option to select multiple genders, or you give them the option to talk about different sexualities, whatever that may be, and that elicits some kind of response from people just kind of questioning why that's suddenly starting to be on a survey. And so kind of navigating those things in a way that's respectful to what they're used to, but also kind of trying to improve research and move forward with a good partnership, I think is really important.
Thank you so much for the panelists to kind of just really unfold some of the challenges, not only about how to do quantitative or qualitative research, obtaining data that is representative and intersectional, but also culturally and socially, we are able to discuss such an important topic. The next overall question will be, in sociological and criminological studies, we always talking about gender neutral versus gender specific or gender responsive approach for crime and deviance. And then there is a general consensus that gender should be the independent variables and in one of the causes to understand crime, deviance, and also the experience in the criminal justice system. So this question will be based on your experiences, based on your research, what can we do to offer a gender responsive approach for those who are justice involved or for those who in need of access to service?
That's a loaded question.
Go ahead.
Oh. I think that we would have to schedule a 12-hour panel to probably answer most of that. I think my quick response, I don't know. I think it would probably be really to start with some of what's already been said. I think in rural places, especially, we're just more resistant to this idea of things being gender responsive. And even like I already mentioned in like our field in criminology, for the most part, the research has just said what happens in urban places is the same as in rural places. What happens with boys and men is the same that happens with girls and women. And so there's not a huge chunk of literature. Well, I shouldn't say that. There's enough literature that says those things are not accurate, but there's not a major following throughout all of the criminological research. So I think because that's still sort of newish in the last few decades, that community people, agencies really aren't necessarily on board with that either. And as Ashley mentioned, like with survey administration, where you go to some of these places and people sort of mock or sort of make fun of, you know, like choose your gender identity, and people, I think in one of Ashley's studies, people sort of laughed and made fun of it. You get people who write in sort of interesting responses, and I think that's
out of like lack of knowledge or understanding perhaps, and not because people necessarily want to be negative about it, but I think there's just not a lot of knowledge there. There are those very traditional values that people keep in well, really everywhere, but rural places. So I don't know that answered the question, but I think that first hurdle is really trying to educate people without talking down to people about like, this is important and this really is what the research says, and there really are unique differences that, you know, we should take into account and how we respond to people. And as someone who usually does work with like juvenile justice involved girls, I think it's really problematic that we don't even offer training, specialized training that shows people like, here's what we know about developmental psychology, or here's what we know about the impact of trauma and how girls respond to trauma differently than how boys, because we're just very consumed by what the behavior is, and we're less trained to think about like why is that the behavior based on something that's maybe underlying. So I think if you don't acknowledge that, like the training piece, like I could probably write training as a policy in every paper ever that I write, because we just don't provide people with that knowledge, and then we wonder why they aren't doing those things. I think people just don't have that information to be able to sort of respond in that way. That was probably talking around it. Nobody even knows what I said or what the question was, but I feel like there's so much embedded in it. I don't know, but that would be my response.
I think my response will also talk completely around it, and I know I've kind of hammered the intersectionality piece probably throughout this, and I'll continue doing so. But I think responding to gender in rural places is kind of in the same vein as responding to just youth needs in general. I think there's a push for, as April mentioned, evidence-based things, but I think considering, you know, there's a push for risk, need, principles, and those things. So considering maybe what a girl's risk is, what her needs are, and keeping those separate from, allowing those to be separate from maybe what a boy in the system is going through, and having additional, you know, programs for girls and things that are specifically catered to different genders, different needs, different educational pieces, things that are actually beneficial, and not just having, you know, a blanket approach to where if you enter this system as a youth, you get thrown these programs and then you go home and we assume that that'll fix it. Just maybe, you know, trying to better allocate those resources or find resources that can be beneficial. Again, that was completely around the question, but.
I'm not sure I have anything to add because I can't remember the original question.
I can.
Sorry.
I can just maybe follow up with.
Yeah.
And then I think both Dr. Terry and Ashley, you really talk about that gender responsive piece, and gender should be a single reason in a way that to consider how the treatment or services should be planned and delivered, and how as researchers we need to put at the forefront. And also I think it seems like from your both answers is that urban has that hierarchy in sociological and criminological research. It seems it's always based upon urban-based literature, and to assume that how rural works is exactly how urban works, which we already know is not exactly the same. So that is why I guess this question is just really about, you know, if I can change this question a little bit less loaded, it will be something like this. What draw you to focusing on rural context, no matter it's gender-based violence? What draw you to this rural context specifically? Just share a little bit more about your passion, original from researching rural context.
Okay, I think I remember your original question now, but I'll move on. So honestly, prior to coming to Fort Hays, I lived in a big city, and I taught at a metropolitan commuter campus, and it was where I'd gone to grad school. People were studying rural sociology, but much like gender, rural sociology, gender sociology are kind of separate silos from like the big field, and I think it's starting to change a bit, but we still think of them as the rural sociologists or the gender sociologists, separate from the sociologists. Not everyone, I don't want to offend all the sociologists who study rural gender at this point, but it was really coming to Fort Hays and hearing about the experiences of my students and recognizing that their experiences before and during college were inherently different than the experiences of students who were at a middle of a big city university. And I think that recognizing some of those intersecting realities are often ignored in the literature really led me to want to know more about how we can better understand and thus better serve our students, but also it's very clear that the experiences are different and place matters. We know that place matters, but I think the sort of juxtaposition of being someplace big and urban to someplace small and not urban makes a pretty clear distinction, and that's what really drew me to start examining it more thoroughly.
I think my response would be that prior to coming here, I have worked with incarcerated youth, and I worked primarily with incarcerated girls across the state, and most of the girls came from very urban places in Kansas, so they came from Wichita and they came from Kansas City. And I don't think I was trained at all. I didn't have any formal education to recognize that there might be differences between where these girls came from. But I think there's a part of me that sort of recognized that their experiences were different, so that once in a while that we would get a girl from the very small little crack of the state, not crack corner, of the state, a little tiny little place in the state. Their stories about how they ended up there just even seem different than the stories of the girl from Wichita. Or when as part of my dissertation work years ago, I interviewed different people in the criminal justice system. And so I could think of several interviews I did with, well, one with a judge in particular, and he would say things like, when girls are acting up at school, or girls aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing, running away, I send them to the middle of nowhere, because that'll teach them to quit doing that. And that, then they won't have anybody to, run to anymore, because they're running to these older boyfriends. And so these are highly educated people where I assumed everybody knew, like, that's not very effective. But that's what they would do, and then move girls to even more remote areas and then assume that would remedy their issues. All you're doing is relocating them and probably adding more issues because of lack of access to services and specialized services, and taking them away from any possible support systems they even had. So I think there was a part of me that sort of recognized that, but I didn't maybe fully recognize it. And then when I did, though, actually have to pick a dissertation topic, I signed myself up for a lot of listservs to see, like, what are people doing, and, like, what could I, what's something unique that's out there. And one article, so, like, I can kind of nerd out and be like, there was that one time this article just really, got me. But it was very unique about coercive sexual experiences for girls, but the whole sample had to do with girls in, like, some of the most urban areas across the U.S., and they just took an angle of, this is how these environments occur, because you live in these highly populated areas with very high reported crime rates and gang-ridden neighborhoods. And as someone who grew up in a very small town in Kansas, I thought, that's not really the same experience. Those girls I worked with from the little corners of the state, like, they didn't come from an urban community with high gang violence on their street corner and very high documented violent crime. And so I thought, that just really doesn't add up, but yet I'm certain these coercive sexualized environments exist. And so that's sort of where, like, my dissertation research took off, and I think that was really the first formal point in time where I studied rural places, because although I didn't disagree with their findings, I thought they sort of, again, assumed what happens to these girls here, you can just apply that anywhere. Well, that's not what it looks like in small communities and rural communities. Those descriptors don't work in trying to explain how they come to have these very coercive environments there. So I think it was sort of my field experience where I was very uneducated and didn't really know what I was seeing, but knew something was off, and then reading that article and something just went, you know what, this just doesn't apply to places in towns like where I grew up, and so let's see if there's something else going on. And now I've just stuck with it. I don't know, I've liked it, so I've stuck with it.
I guess from my piece, I came from one of those programs that was very, urban is the only thing that matters, and quantitative data is the only thing that matters. And then starting to look at what research we have done on various aspects of the criminal justice system and kind of doing the math in my head and saying, okay, we at best studied 1,000 criminal justice systems across the US, and there are at least 18,000 different police departments alone. So we know nothing about nothing. And then coming to Fort Hays and recognizing, okay, all of my students, the biggest town they've been in some cases is Hays. And I'm trying to explain, okay, this is how it worked in Chicago almost 100 years ago, and realizing that, okay, you don't have a frame of reference for this. And then realizing that, okay, that's everything we know about criminology. And then having to tailor all of the statistical training and methodological expertise that I got in grad school, and recognizing that that works for New Orleans and Cincinnati and Wichita, but Atchison, Kansas, that's not going to work. Or Hays even, it's not going to work, and having to recognize that we have some serious methodological issues that we need to work out if we're going to understand anything about what's going on in these rural areas.
For me, my research interest started actually, my master's is in clinical psychology, so I kind of started this research journey looking at mental health and trauma, and specifically stigmatization that exists around that in communities. And April and I are actually from the same small town, but that kind of put a different perspective for me when I started researching and looking into the stigma of mental illness, because while that is pervasive across the country, it is different in rural places. So for example, if you have an urban place where there's 15 different mental health centers, it's maybe people aren't going to see you there, but if you're from a small area and there's only one and your car's parked there, that's probably going to look a little bit more stigmatizing, or you might be ostracized a little bit differently than you would in those rural places. But specifically getting into the justice system, there is a big overlap, obviously, between mental health and the justice system. So my interests in rural juvenile justice are kind of just the coupling of that. So how individuals are stigmatized from their mental illness, but then how those can be increased or changed when it's mental illness and it's also someone that's in a stigmatized population anyways, and then we add in gender to that, and it just keeps going.
So it sounds like from our panelists, the rural research on gender and violence is always that missing piece, and no matter from your personal experience or from your research experience, you seek that breaking point and then decided that will be one of your passions to keep seeking the answers and providing policies, recommendations to better serving these individuals in rural spaces. So now I think I want to have another kind of a celebratorial final question. First of all, I want to thank FHSU Forsyth Library to actually help us co-sponsoring and promoting this event. And especially I want to mention that actually the library will showcase faculty's research through their research repository and kind of celebrate research, no matter that is in one specific area or that is really rural specific. So I guess my final question before we can open the floor to the audience is, are there any other research activities or any new research proposals or anything related to gender research, rural, that you may want to share with our audience? Just some type of like a sneak peek of what you're doing right now.
Sure. Well, I have someone in the audience, a student in the audience, who has completed some survey research with me regarding the mental health of rural police officers. So it's very forthcoming sneak peek because it's on the to-do list. But we assume that we will find differences in mental health training, mental health literacy, how people respond to traumatic situations based on, well, we assume lots of different factors, but it's not necessarily gender specific, although we will, that, again, it's always part of the picture, I think, but we will look at differences there. So that will be forthcoming. And then perhaps just, I continue to do work in our state's women's correctional facility, the only facility we have in Kansas, with a colleague in the teacher education department, Sarah Broman Miller. So we have sort of a partnership at our women's facility where her students, her practicum students, teach some literacy and reading skills to the moms and grandmas there. My students do more of the helping with collecting of research. And so we've always actually, I said I'm a qualitative person, but we've been doing survey research with that. But I just really am qualitative, so I hope this year to change the project up to where we're doing more of like a focus group and just actually getting to have conversations with them about the impact of the project and parenting from prison. Because I think there's just far more value, not to undermine quantitative stuff, but I think I can get different responses than I would in a paper or pencil setting, so you can stay tuned for that, I suppose.
Okay, I'm not sure I have a lot to add. I'm working on a project with a team that the same student has provided some great feedback for, and we're interested in developing some trauma-informed educational practices, and I think that being in a more rural area, and particularly students coming from rural areas, can benefit from faculty who are able to engage with some trauma-informed practices, and also recognizing that that kind of terminology is often not as accepted in rural areas in the first place. So that's a project that I'm working on that is not only about gender, but certainly gender is a big piece of that.
I guess the only research piece I have that's actually relevant to the panel's topic is I'm currently writing up an analysis of a survey we sent out to the Fort Hays population last fall concerning their perceptions of the campus community and how that relates to whether or not they've been the victim of different types of crime or adverse experiences such as gender or racial violence, gender or racial bias, just standard assaults like a shoving match in the dorms to being the victim of property crime. And we've been able to associate that to a wellness measure provided by the, I guess it's the Student Health and Wellness Center now, and seeing how those community perceptions impact the likelihood that someone's going to be victimized and how that victimization translates to a lower wellness score. So, writing it up now, so hopefully you'll be able to read about it in maybe 6 months, since that to-do list is pretty long at this point.
Nicole and I also have some data from a study we did now probably right before COVID started that we've written one paper out of, but it's looking at perceptions from different members in communities across Kansas, so law enforcement, corrections, mental health, religious affiliations, on just some of their perceptions of things including gender, so places where sexual abuse happens, how those things might differ for boys and girls, stigma of mental illness. So it's been a little while since we collected that, but there's still a lot of data there. So hoping to look into that a little bit more, maybe write a couple pieces out of that in the upcoming future too.
Thank you so much. It sounds like there are a lot of going on, and then we are really looking forward to read your upcoming publication pieces. I think now we are concluding with our actually formal panelist discussion. Now is really some time maybe you can engage with some of our audiences, or if you have any questions or recommendations even, if you have a specific area you think rural area should focus on more, we are open the floor for open discussion.
Ms. Lockwood and Dr. Terry spoke a little bit about some of the difficulties with research, especially in rural communities, when viewing gender as a non-binary system. And so I was wondering how research, whether qualitative or quantitative, is going to have to change to adapt to include some of those gender demographics that might slip through the cracks in rural communities.
I think I heard that question partially. You're asking how research could change to include or be more inclusive of non-binary genders. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yes.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there are a multitude of different ways that can be done. I've seen, just at a very basic level, survey research making more of an effort to have more options, so not just having male, female, other. But I also think, through a qualitative perspective, maybe asking people their gender and then asking them a little bit to speak on that, and not, having them check a box, allowing them to kind of tell you their experience, tell you what they identify as, and make that as detailed as they would like to be, so not just, having them check that box and then moving forward. I don't know if that answers your question in a detail enough, but.
I guess from a quantitative perspective, I know that, I'm unfamiliar with the scales, but I know psychology and sociology both have gender identity scales, where instead of it being a forced choice, individuals get to choose where on the spectrum they fall on a particular measure, and that can be used to basically describe where someone falls on a gender identity scale without having them declare male, female, other, etc. So,
There's also should I use the mic? Doesn't matter. I think there's a piece in both qualitative and quantitative where you have to normalize multiple options. I think we see this with perhaps changes in something like the census over time. When we expand our categories, people are more likely than over time to fill multiple categories. But that's a slow-moving process, right? So I think there's a piece of just exposure to multiple categories that can be beneficial. And in qualitative, right, we just have to frame things so that we're not asking in sort of presumptive binary ways. So we can ask someone about their gender identity without saying, are you either or? And, be willing to answer questions when people say, why are you asking that, or what does that mean? But I think it's an ongoing process that we need to be sensitive to, and I think it can be a bit of a bummer that it's a slow-moving process, that exposure to multiple categories has to happen for a while before we start to think that that's just the norm. Does that answer anything?
Thank you.
They've all answered it, so I don't have anything to add.
Ask riffing off of that, though, are there means for making the whole situation safer for, you were talking about being sensitive about how you're asking it or what options you're giving. And earlier, Ashley mentioned about, or perhaps it was April, about the difficulty of getting responses, gender responsive, and the type of flippant responses maybe that you would get or something. Is there opportunity there for looking at that qualitative data, how it was answered, for further research about how to make that a more inclusive and safe activity? I'm not sure I'm saying, it'd be interesting to see where you see with the other demographics within the study, or that person's response to other questions, or that kind of thing, about what that may reveal. Are there studies like that are looking at the nature of the responses and what the other data of that respondent tells you?
I do not know. But I was thinking of the research that Morgan spoke about here at the university, and I can recall, even though he did most of the analysis, saying that we had people fill in, right, their own, we tried to be very inclusive and create a very long list of options, but I think still at the end we had kind of an open box or option if you didn't opt for anything that was listed. And people wrote in very long kind of, but we can't really assume necessarily that they did it to be resistant or whatnot, but I don't know that we truly had enough of those to draw any conclusions about it. But I personally haven't intentionally sought out research that would say how do you deal with that, or is there anything that we can determine about people who potentially answer it in a deceiving way on purpose or something. I really don't know. So I don't know if other people do. I don't know.
You mentioned that Kansas was trying to do better at data collection. Is there an effort to collect data on genders outside the binary?
Yeah, so I actually serve on our state advisory group for juvenile justice and delinquency prevention. And so that is a recommendation that we're making this upcoming year to the governor's office. So we requested last year, show us your data, we need to know what's happening. But we also get federal funding to ensure that we don't have disparate treatment of youth of color. So that's really where that first came from. And they said, here's the best that we have. And we said, oh, it looks like this is a problem. I mean, we weren't surprised, but that's a problem. And then they said, here's basically what we can tell you. We know about boys and girls, and we know about white and non-white kids. And we said, well, it's a start, but there's so much more out there that we need to know. And so one of our recommendations is you should be intentionally asking about gender identity, asking about anything that kids are willing to share with you so that we can get a better picture, because we know from research, kids who don't, LGBTQ youth are more involved in the system than heterosexually identifying youth. Like, we know that's a problem. But Kansas doesn't track any of that. They don't require that, but we are recommending that they try to think outside of very basic, identifiers, and at least allow kids to identify that if they want to, and then track it. They don't have to take that recommendation, but we are recommending it. We recommend many things, but that is, I made that intentionally in the report several times. This is important here and here and here and here, but if they choose not to require the state to do it, then they won't do it.
So it all sounds like that in rural research there has to be an element of advocacy, advocating for the rural experiences and how it's different. And when you start looking at like those big decisions made of people at the top, they're looking at where the populations are, and that's not rural communities. They're looking at urban populations. So how can you advocate for people to look more at the rural experience and then tailor policy and practice that meets those people?
I guess from a public policy standpoint, you'd want a solution that works for all parties. So the state of Kansas has a problem with recording racial, ethnic, gender binary, sexual orientation in juvenile populations. It's not just within the rural context, but it's more exacerbated in the rural context because we're dealing with people who are tens, if not 100 miles away from a mental health provider or someone who could help them with their situation. So having a data collection system, for instance, that is mandated across the state where you have to fill in all these different boxes, you have to ask these questions, would be very beneficial just from a data collection standpoint, but also it gets it out there that this is something that's tracked. This is something that's important. There is money behind this. So if our little county has an issue where we need a mental health provider because a third of our children that are coming into our center are dealing with mental health problems that are independent from socioeconomics or being the victims of child abuse or something like that, and we need a specialized provider, that's how you would get that provider. You would have to show that you have a quantifiable need for something, which is, I think, where it comes back to we need better data. And the best way to do that is make it standardized across the state and the municipality so that we're collecting all that information for everyone.
Can I add something? I feel like that is why research inform policy. That is why we need to conduct more rural-based research and to make that policy suggestions. If every research is out from a urban context, of course there is no emphasis in rural. So that is why we're trying to encouraging more rural-focused research to allow the policymakers and those who may have a decision to allocate more resource and access to rural population and rural spaces as well.
I would follow up on what Dr. Craig said earlier about normalizing just asking questions. And I would say that that's equally true for the rural piece. Like, even in this report that I'm writing, like, they will see the word rural or remote in there, and that's never been in that report before. But I think if you just put it out there as much as you can and you draw people's attention to it, it becomes a little more I don't know if normalized is the word, but it becomes part of the conversation and it becomes something that people think about. When we just don't include it, like, then people continue to move forward not including it. So I try to flash the rule word out there as much as I can, because then I think people might go, oh, okay, like maybe there's something that we should care about here.
I think also adding rural into the equation is kind of like advocating for probably anything else you would advocate for. So like April just mentioned, bringing it into the conversation in a way that's respectful and kind of opens up to talk about whatever those experiences may be. Hayes isn't exactly a booming metropolis. So I think when we go to places where we're at bigger conferences or where you're with, whatever your job may be, when you leave Fort Hayes or whatever you're doing, when you're in conversations and you're in places where people are maybe talking about urban things, saying, hey, that's a good point, but what about people that are in XYZ parts of the country? Or what about girls or genders that are in smaller towns or more remote areas or more geographically isolated areas? And how can we make sure, the policies are making whatever we're trying to do still applies there and is still effective there?
Oh, thank you so much. I think this is conclude our first actually in-person and / virtual roundtable series with the center. And we want to thank FHSU once again to help FHSU Forsyth Library again to help us really set up a technology and allowed us to really advocate for the need of rural research. And if you do interested in follow more event with the center, actually next Wednesday we have a on-campus event called Together We Heal, Together We Rise, with actually Becca Stevens, the founder and CEO of Thistle Farms in Nashville, Tennessee. She actually will be in person on campus talking about her social entrepreneur model, how her model empowering women who are justice involved and who are formerly sex trafficked. So if you are interested in such topic, please make sure to join us next Wednesday, September 29th at Black and Gold Room from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. for the workshop, and the exclusive keynote speech 7 p.m. to 8 p.m. at the Beach Schmidt. And then if you want to follow us with more events or roundtable series as such, please make sure to snap our QR code, check out our website, and we're looking forward to see everybody in such a welcoming and engaging community once again. Thank you so much. Thank you for the panelists too.